It is late. You are lying still, but something in you is not still at all. The ceiling has not changed. The room is the same room it was an hour ago, and yet your mind is moving, sorting, replaying, rehearsing conversations that already happened, drafting responses to arguments no one is having. This is the night mind, and it has been trying to tell you something. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent 60 years mapping the interior landscape of the human psyche, believed that the mind at night is not broken. He believed it is awake in a different way, awake to what the daylight hours bury. In 1913, Jung sat alone in his study in Zurich. He had just severed his professional relationship with Sigmund Freud, the man who had called him his intellectual heir. The break was painful. Jung was isolated. He began hearing what he described as inner voices, fragments of images, half-formed figures pressing at the edge of his awareness. Another psychiatrist might have diagnosed himself ill. Jung did something else. He listened. He began writing down what he heard, what he saw when he closed his eyes, what arrived in his dreams and in the space just before sleep. He did this for years, filling a large red-bound manuscript he later called the Red Book, a document he kept hidden for nearly a century, showing it to almost no one. What Jung was doing, alone in that Zurich study, was exactly what he would spend the rest of his life teaching others to do. He was listening to the unconscious. The unconscious, for Jung, was not simply a storage room for things you have forgotten. It was a living system, as real and purposeful as consciousness itself, but moving by different rules, speaking in different languages, symbols, dreams. The sudden heaviness that descends on a Tuesday afternoon with no apparent cause. The irritation you feel towards someone who reminds you of something you have not yet named. Tonight, we are going to spend some time in that landscape, not to fix anything, not to arrive anywhere in particular, just to listen the way Jung listened, quietly, with some patience, with the room already dark. Let your shoulders drop. Feel where your body rests against the surface beneath you. That weight is real. You are here. There are two kinds of tiredness. One is the tiredness of a body that has been used well. The other is something quieter, a fatigue that persists even after sleep, a tiredness that does not belong to the muscles. Jung had a name for what causes the second kind. We will come to it. There is also something your mind has been avoiding. Not today, perhaps, but for a while. It waits with patience, the way a shadow waits at the edge of a lamp's reach. It does not go away because you do not look at it. It simply waits. We will come to that as well. For now, it is enough to be in this room, to let the day go still, to know that what we are doing tonight, this slow movement through ideas that arrived from one man's 60 years of listening, is not work. It is closer to the thing that happens just before sleep, when the mind softens its grip and something older than thought begins to speak. Jung believed that consciousness is a small island in a very large sea. Tonight, we sit at the edge of that island, and we let the water come in. The night mind is not your enemy. It never was. It is just trying to finish a conversation you started a long time ago. Chapter 2. Stop Fighting the Shadow. In 1916, Carl Jung wrote a short, strange essay. He titled it 7 Sermons to the Dead. He wrote it in 3 evenings, barely stopping. When it was done, he said the house felt calm again, as if something that had been pressing against the walls had finally been let out. The essay speaks of a concept Jung was still forming at the time. He called it the shadow. The shadow is not evil. That is the first misunderstanding, and it costs people a great deal. The shadow is everything you have decided you are not. Every trait you disapproved of and buried. Every feeling you were taught was too loud, too dark, too embarrassing. Every impulse you learned to suppress before it became visible. Not because those things were wrong, but because someone, a parent, a classroom, a culture, made clear they were unacceptable. Robert Johnson, the Jungian analyst and author of Owning Your Own Shadow, published in 1991, wrote plainly about this. He said that what we exile from our conscious identity does not disappear. It moves. It settles into a layer of the psyche that operates below awareness, and from there it influences our behavior in ways we cannot see because we are looking in the wrong direction. A man who was told as a boy that anger was shameful does not stop feeling anger. He stops recognizing it. It arrives instead as a headache, a sudden contempt for someone at work, a tightness in the jaw at a family dinner he cannot explain. The anger is still present. It has simply changed its address. Richard was 54 when his wife pointed this out. They were sitting in their kitchen in a house they had lived in for 20 years, and she said quietly that he seemed unreachable. Not cold, not unkind, unreachable. He had no idea what she meant. He worked hard. He provided. He was never loud, never volatile. He did not understand for another 2 years, until a therapist asked him a simple question. When was the last time you let yourself want something? He could not answer. What Richard had buried was not anger, as it turned out. It was hunger. A hunger for something he had learned early on was selfish to want. And because he could not want anything, he could also not fully be with anyone. The shadow had not made him dangerous. It had made him absent. James Hillman, the American depth psychologist and author of Revisioning Psychology, wrote that the shadow is not a problem to be solved, it is a companion to be acknowledged. The goal is not to eliminate it, which is impossible, but to stop pretending it does not exist. This is the part that most of us resist, because the shadow contains things we are not proud of, jealousies we think are beneath us, competitive urges we have dressed up as concern, resentments we have rationalized as principles. And there is something deeply uncomfortable about sitting with those things, turning them over in the quiet and recognizing them as ours. But Jung observed this. What we do not make conscious appears in our life as fate. He meant it practically. The man who never acknowledges his need for recognition will find himself mysteriously furious every time someone else receives it. The woman who never accepts her capacity for coldness will find herself stunned by the cruelty she seems to attract. We do not project what we know about ourselves, we project what we have refused to know. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath move naturally. Stopping the fight with the shadow does not mean surrendering to your worst impulses. It means stopping the pretense that those impulses belong to someone else. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the part of you that has been carrying what you refuse to hold. Tonight, it is enough to know that it is there. You do not have to do anything with it yet. Just let it stop being a secret. Chapter 3. Stop calling anxiety weakness. In 1844, a Danish philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard published a book called The Concept of Anxiety. He was 30 years old, living alone in Copenhagen, doing most of his writing at night. The book made an argument that almost no one in his lifetime took seriously, but that Jung would return to nearly a century later and find essential. Kierkegaard wrote that anxiety is not a malfunction. It is the emotional signal of freedom. When you feel anxious, you are not experiencing a breakdown. You are experiencing the weight of possibility, the recognition that you could do otherwise, that the future is open, that nothing is fixed. He called it the dizziness of freedom. Carl Jung read Kierkegaard carefully. He did not treat anxiety as a symptom to be suppressed. He treated it as a communication, a signal from the psyche about something that had not yet been integrated. In his clinical notes from the 1930s and 1940s, Jung repeatedly observed that patients who successfully eliminated their anxiety through suppression did not become calmer. They became smaller. The psyche contracted, the world narrowed. What they had called anxiety was, in many cases, the energy needed for growth, and they had spent years trying to destroy it. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist who worked at Harvard in the late 19th century, wrote in The Principles of Psychology that emotions are not reactions to events. They are part of the event itself, the body's way of participating in what is happening, not merely commenting on it. Anxiety is not separate from the situation. It is information about what the situation means to you. Alfred Adler, Jung's contemporary and another early figure in depth psychology, believed that anxiety almost always carries a specific message. That message, when decoded, is usually about a gap between who you are and who you sense you could be. Not anxiety about failure, anxiety about the unlived possibility on the other side of the thing you are not yet doing. This is a different frame than the one most people carry. Most people were taught that anxiety means something is wrong with them, that calm people do not feel this way, that the goal is to reduce it, contain it, learn techniques for managing it until it diminishes. But the technique for managing anxiety that actually works is not suppression, it is curiosity. Sitting down with the feeling and asking, what are you about? Not diagnosing it, not labeling it, just asking the way you would ask a person in the next room, what is happening? Elena had lived with what she called low-level dread for most of her adult life. A background hum of unease she could not attribute to anything in particular. She had tried medication. She had tried exercise, which helped. She had tried busyness, which helped more, until it stopped helping. She retired at 63 with every reason to feel relief and found the dread intensified. A counselor she saw in those first months asked a question from a different direction. She asked, "What have you always meant to do?" Elena paused for a long time. Then she named 3 things. One was writing. She had wanted to write since she was a girl. She had not written a single page in 40 years. The dread was not evidence of weakness. It was her unlived self accumulating interest. Jung would have recognized this immediately. He wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the autobiographical account he completed near the end of his life, that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. When we avoid the real difficulty, the psyche generates a false one. The real difficulty, in Elena's case, was not retirement, it was the blank page. The dread was pointing directly at what needed to be done. Notice your breath for a moment. Let it move at its own pace. Calling anxiety weakness is like calling hunger an inconvenience. It is a signal. It is trying to deliver a message. The question is not how to make it stop. The question is what it is asking you to look at. Chapter 4. Stop ignoring your dreams. Marie-Louise von France worked alongside Carl Jung for 30 years. She was his closest collaborator, and she spent most of her professional life doing what Jung had begun, the careful, patient interpretation of dreams, not as entertainment, as clinical material. She wrote in her 1978 book on dreams and death that the dream is the psyche's native language. When the conscious mind sleeps, the unconscious speaks without the editorial interference that waking life imposes. The figures that appear, the strangers, the houses, the recurring corridors are not random. They are purposeful communications from a part of the self that has no other way to be heard. Jung himself dreamed prolifically. He recorded his dreams beginning in his early 30s and continued until near the end of his life. He analyzed them the way a scientist analyzes data, looking for patterns, for recurring symbols, for messages that his waking mind might be resisting. One of his most documented dreams came in the autumn of 1913, shortly before the outbreak of the First World War. He dreamed of a great flood covering all of Europe. He saw the water rising carrying wreckage and bodies. He dreamed this twice. He was disturbed enough to consider whether he was developing psychosis. Then the war began. Jung came to believe his dream had accessed something in the collective unconscious, the shared substrate of human experience underlying individual psychology, holding the fears and patterns of entire civilizations. He had not predicted the war. He had simply received a signal already present in the psychic atmosphere. Sigmund Freud, with whom Jung had collaborated intensively between 1906 and 1913, believed dreams were primarily wish fulfillments, disguised expressions of repressed desire. Jung agreed this was sometimes true, but he thought Freud had stopped short of the full picture. For Jung, dreams also anticipate. They rehearse. They compensate for imbalance in waking life. A man who is too controlled may dream of chaos. A woman who has been too acquiescent may dream of rage. The dream is not condemning her, it is showing her what has been suppressed and is now seeking expression. Ignoring dreams, in the Jungian framework, is not a neutral act. It is a choice to let the unconscious speak without a listener. And what goes unheard does not go away. It returns the next night and the night after that in different costume, always circling the same unresolved center. You may not remember your dreams. Most people who say this simply wake in a way that cuts the memory before it can form. Jung recommended keeping a notebook by the bed and writing immediately upon waking, not after coffee. The dream belongs to the transition state. 5 minutes in, it has usually dissolved. But even without specific memory, the texture of a night's dreams can be felt. The mood you wake with, the low hum of something unresolved, the image that drifts back at unexpected moments through the day. Let your body go heavy where it rests. What Jung asked of his patients was simpler than most people expect. He did not ask them to decode the dream according to a fixed symbol system. He asked them to stay with it, to sit with its images the way you would sit with a painting in a museum, not trying to explain it, but letting it work on you. Dreams do not announce themselves in plain language because the part of the psyche that generates them does not use plain language. It uses image. It uses compression. It uses the logic of emotion rather than the logic of argument. Stopping the habit of ignoring them is not about becoming a dream analyst. It is about restoring a basic conversation, one that has been going on since long before recorded history, in every culture that ever existed, between the sleeping mind and the waking self. That conversation has something for you. It has been waiting. Chapter 5. Stop performing a false self. Donald Winnicott was a British pediatrician and psychoanalyst who spent decades working with children and their mothers. In the 1950s and 1960s, he developed an idea that became central to developmental psychology: the distinction between the true self and the false self. The true self, for Winnicott, is the part of the child that emerges when they feel safe enough to simply be. No performance, no adjustment. The response to what is actually felt before that response gets edited by the awareness of what is acceptable. The false self develops out of necessity. When a child learns through the reactions of a parent, through the social pressure of a classroom, through the accumulated weight of hundreds of small moments that certain parts of them are unwelcome, they build a surface self that is more manageable, a self that can be presented without causing problems. This is not pathology in childhood, it is adaptation. Children do not survive without it. The problem comes later. The false self, built for a specific environment, does not automatically dissolve when the environment changes. It calcifies. It becomes the default. And the person goes through adult life presenting the adapted version of themselves, competent, agreeable, controlled, while the original version waits somewhere below, increasingly unfamiliar. Jung called this the persona. He borrowed the word from the Latin term for the masks worn by Roman actors, literally, the thing that speaks through. He saw it as necessary and legitimate. We all need a persona to navigate social life. The problem, he wrote, arises when a person becomes identical with their persona, when the mask is worn so long that the face beneath it is forgotten. Helena had been a project manager for 18 years. She was extremely good at it, calm in a crisis, decisive under pressure, able to read a room and calibrate her communication to exactly what each person needed to hear. When she left that role at 59, she expected to feel free. Instead, she felt erased. Without the role, she did not know who was left. The competence had been real. The accomplishments had been real. But somewhere in the construction of the professional self, the personal self had been left untended. She sat in her kitchen on the first morning of retirement and felt with startling clarity that she had no idea what she actually wanted for breakfast. It sounds small. It was not small. Winnicott wrote that the false self is maintained at a cost. The cost is a persistent sense of unreality, a feeling that nothing quite lands. That experience is observed rather than felt. This is not depression exactly. It is more like watching your own life through glass. Jung, writing about the process of individuation, the lifelong movement toward becoming fully oneself, was clear that it requires this confrontation, not the dismantling of the persona. The persona is useful, but the recognition that you are not your persona, that beneath it is something older and more specific. Notice the weight of your head against whatever it rests on. Let your face soften. The performance stops tonight in a simple way. Not by making any decision, not by changing anything, just by lying in this room and letting the role go quiet for a few hours. The persona does not travel into sleep. In sleep, the mask comes off without effort. The face beneath it, uncertain, specific, not always comfortable, is what the dreams see. And that face is the one Jung was interested in. That face is the one worth knowing. Chapter 6. Stop feeding the inner critic. Late in his career, Carl Jung described what he called The inner critic in the language of a specific archetype, a figure he named the senex, the Latin word for old man. The senex is the voice of rigid authority, the voice that evaluates everything you do and finds it insufficient. Not the voice of genuine conscience, which is quiet and specific. The voice of the inner critic is loud and general. It says, "Not enough." It says, "You should have done more, said more, been more." It wakes you at 3 a.m. to review your failures with the impartial efficiency of an accountant who has already decided the books do not balance. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher who wrote the Meditations as private journal entries in the years 170 to 180 CE, understood this voice well. He wrote to himself, morning after morning, not to amplify it, but to displace it. His practice was to begin each day by reminding himself what the day actually required, rather than what the internal auditor had decided about the previous day. He did not silence the critic. He starved it by redirecting his attention to what could still be done. Ethan Kross, an American psychologist at the University of Michigan and the author of Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, has spent years studying self-talk and its effects on psychological functioning. He found that the inner critic, the voice that addresses us in first person, that says, "I am not enough," can be quieted in a counterintuitive way by referring to yourself by name, by stepping outside the first-person frame. What Kross discovered was that the shift from "I failed at this" to "Thomas struggled with this today" creates a small but measurable psychological distance. You become the observer of the thought rather than the person consumed by it. The critic's words do not disappear. They carry less weight when they are about someone you can see from a slight remove. Thomas learned this accidentally. He was 51, a man who ran a small accounting firm, and his mind at night was a tribunal. Every case he had managed, every conversation he could have handled better, every decision he had made and doubted, assembled in the dark and waited for his verdict. He had been doing this for years. He thought it was conscientiousness. He thought it was what responsible people did. His wife asked him once, gently, whether he ever said anything kind to himself. He did not understand the question at first. Then he understood it. The answer was no. The inner critic is not fed by failure. It is fed by engagement. The more you argue with it, the more it grows. The more you try to refute its charges, the more charges it finds. What starves it is not argument. It is attention turned elsewhere. Jung, in a 1935 lecture at the Tavistock Clinic in London, said that what you resist persists. He was speaking about the unconscious broadly, but the inner critic is an excellent demonstration. The critical voice that you fight, you amplify. The one you stop engaging with, you diminish. Let your jaw soften. Let the shoulders drop. This does not mean ignoring genuine errors. There is a legitimate voice of conscience that speaks specifically, briefly, and then quiets. It says, "That conversation could have gone differently. Here is how." Then it stops. The inner critic does not stop. It is not interested in improvement. It is interested in control. And the thing that keeps it running is your attention, your willingness to sit with it through the night, arguing, justifying, apologizing to a voice that does not accept apologies. Tonight, you do not have to feed it. You can simply let it be present in the background, the way a radio in another room is present, audible, not requiring a response. The room is quiet. The critic may keep speaking. You do not have to reply. Chapter 7. Stop fearing solitude. In the winter of 1654, the French mathematician Blaise Pascal wrote a line that has survived nearly 4 centuries of philosophical argument. He wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." Pascal was writing from experience. He was 31 years old, chronically ill, living at a monastery in Port Royal outside Paris. He was one of the most brilliant minds of his century, the founder of probability theory, a man who had dined with the finest intellectual company in France, and he chose to sit in a cold room and think. What he understood from the inside was that solitude is not the problem. The fear of solitude is the problem. The noise we generate, the busyness, the plans, the constant stimulation is not a love of company. It is an avoidance of what arrives when company is removed. Carl Jung wrote about solitude with the respect of someone who had depended on it. At the age of 59, he began building a stone tower by hand on the shores of Lake Zurich in the village of Bollingen. It had no electricity, no telephone. He cooked on an open fire. He spent weeks there alone, working with his hands, thinking, writing. He called it his tower. He wrote in memories, dreams, reflections that there he felt close to his essential self, the part that did not require a role, a reputation, or an audience. He built it in stages over 20 years, adding rooms as his psychological needs changed. Henry David Thoreau, the American essayist who spent 2 years in a small cabin at Walden Pond beginning in 1845, made the same discovery from a different direction. He found that solitude did not make him lonely. It made him available to his own thoughts, to the texture of the world, to the kind of attention that crowds make impossible. Thoreau wrote that the man who goes to the wood and finds it empty has not yet looked closely enough. The wood is full. The room is full. It is the person who has been too busy to notice. What makes solitude frightening is not emptiness. It is what fills it. When the noise stops, something comes. Jung was direct about this. When you stop distracting yourself, the unconscious material that you have been avoiding with activity begins to surface. It is not comfortable at first. It is specifically uncomfortable because it has been waiting a long time. The fear of solitude is, at bottom, a fear of this meeting, a fear of what you will find when you sit with yourself without interruption. Jung's answer to this fear was not reassurance, it was practice. He wrote that the more you practice solitude, not the forced isolation of loneliness, but the chosen quiet of a person who has decided to be present with themselves, the less frightening it becomes. What you feared to find turns out, in most cases, to be less monstrous than imagined. And often it is simply sad, a tiredness that needed space, a longing that needed room to exist, nothing requiring action, just requiring acknowledgement. Let your body settle where it rests. The room you are in right now is a form of solitude, not frightening, just quiet. This is the thing Pascal understood from his cold room, and Jung understood from his stone tower, and Thoreau understood from his small cabin in the Massachusetts woods. Solitude does not take anything from you. It gives back what the noise has been covering. Whatever waits for you in the quiet is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has been most patiently waiting. Chapter 8. Stop chasing mental clarity. In the early 1900s, a French psychologist named Pierre Janet was working at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, the same institution where Jean-Martin Charcot had studied hysteria decades before. Janet was interested in what he called psychological tension, the sense of aliveness and coherence that a person experiences when they are fully engaged with their present experience. He observed that when people were depleted, psychologically overwhelmed, or in states of trauma, their psychological tension dropped. They could not hold the present moment. Memory fragmented. Perception narrowed. Carl Jung read Janet's work carefully. He agreed with the clinical observation, but drew a different conclusion. The reason mental clarity becomes elusive, Jung argued, was not because the mind was failing, it was because the mind was doing too much. Specifically, it was doing the work of maintaining a conscious position that required constant effort to sustain because the unconscious was pressing against it. When the unconscious is in conflict with the conscious attitude, Jung wrote, the person experiences precisely this: mental fog, difficulty concentrating, a sense that thoughts will not cohere. It is not a cognitive deficiency, it is psychic friction. The solution that most people try is to push harder, to concentrate more, to find the right technique, the right morning routine, the right framework that will finally produce the clear thinking they are after. Erich Neumann, the Israeli psychologist and one of Jung's most rigorous students, wrote in The Origins and History of Consciousness, published in 1949, that Western culture has produced a specific pathology, the over-valorization of clarity. The belief that to be unclear is to be defective, that the goal of mental life is transparent efficiency, in which every thought is organized and every decision is rational. Neumann called this the heroic ego, and he pointed out that the heroic ego exhausts itself. It cannot sustain indefinite clarity without the support of what lies beneath it. What lies beneath it is the unconscious, and the unconscious is not clear. It is vast and symbolic and non-linear. It does not yield to discipline, it yields to attention. Let your shoulders fall. Notice the breath. You do not have to breathe correctly. Let it move as it wants. The chasing of mental clarity, The constant demand that your mind produce coherent, structured, efficient output is one of the ways we exhaust the psyche. It is a demand made by the persona on the whole self, without asking whether the whole self has the resources to comply. Jung spent years working with highly intelligent, highly accomplished people who came to him precisely because their mental capacities had stopped working the way they expected. Not because something was wrong with their intelligence, because they had been running the conscious mind without attending to what the unconscious was doing. The prescription was not to try harder, it was to stop, to sit with the unclear, to let the ambiguous remain ambiguous, to stop demanding from the mind a product it cannot currently produce, and trust that, given rest, given space, given the kind of quiet that this room already offers, something will eventually arrange itself. Clarity in the Jungian understanding is not made, it emerges. It comes after the period of confusion, not by fighting through the confusion, but by sitting inside it long enough that it begins to thin. Whatever your mind has been pursuing tonight, whatever problem it has been turning over, you can set it down. Not permanently. Just for these hours. The clarity you are looking for is not something you can chase. It arrives when you stop running. Chapter 9, The Unconscious Keeps Score. Thomas had been waking at 3 in the morning for 11 months. Not with nightmares, just awake, sharply, suddenly awake, in the way that leaves no question of returning to sleep. He lay there each time running calculations, what he owed, what was unfinished, what conversation he had managed poorly, what project was behind schedule. His wife, asleep beside him, seemed to inhabit an entirely different experience of night. He lay there doing accounting in the dark, and the books never balanced. He was not anxious, he told himself. Anxious people were people with actual problems. He was just aware of the complexity of everything. Bessel van der Kolk, the Dutch-American psychiatrist who spent decades studying trauma and wrote The Body Keeps the Score in 2014, observed that the nervous system records experience with a completeness the conscious mind never matches. Every overwhelming experience, every moment of unresolved fear, every situation in which the body prepared a response that was never allowed to complete, all of it is held in the body's own memory, in patterns of muscle tension, arousal, and vigilance. The body does not forget, and at night, when the distractions of the day are removed, it presents its evidence. Thomas's 3 a.m. waking was not random. The nervous system that spends a working day in controlled alertness has work left to do when the control is removed. The vigilance finds another form. The accounting continues because the underlying state, chronic low-level readiness, has never been discharged. Carl Jung did not have the neuroscience that van der Kolk later developed, but he described the same phenomenon in psychological terms. He called it autonomous complexes, areas of the psyche that have taken on a life of their own, that operate below conscious control and activate without permission, generating feeling states and thought patterns that the person experiences as intrusive. A complex, in Jung's understanding, is a cluster of experience and emotion organized around a central theme: the abandonment complex, the failure complex, the complex around worthiness. Each one crystallizes out of specific experience, often early experience, and goes on operating long after the original situation has passed. What Thomas was experiencing at 3 a.m. was not new accounting, it was old accounting. The ledger his mind was reviewing was not this week's professional record. It was something older, the record of a boy who learned early and thoroughly that his value was conditional on his performance. Jung wrote that we do not have complexes, they have us. Notice your breath for a moment. Let the jaw go soft. Feel the weight of the body. The unconscious keeps its own score. It keeps it not out of malice, but out of a kind of loyalty to what it has been given. It holds what the conscious mind deemed unimportant or unbearable. It keeps it alive because it believes at some level that does not have access to the present moment that it still matters. The work is not to dispute the score. The work is to let the scorekeeper know that the game those numbers belong to is over, that the conditions that made the tally urgent no longer exist, that it is safe in this particular night, in this particular room, to put the ledger down. The unconscious does not accept this reassurance quickly. It has been keeping score for decades. It will take more than one night. But it can hear the instruction, even now, even in the dark. The body remembers, but the body is also lying still tonight, and stillness, repeated, becomes its own kind of message. Chapter 10: Why Symbols Visit at Night. In the summer of 1961, a few weeks before he died, Carl Jung finished a manuscript he had been working on with a group of collaborators. He called it Man and His Symbols. He had written most of it after a vivid dream in which he stood before a large audience of ordinary people, not academics, who wanted to understand what he had spent his life discovering. The dream told him to write for them, not for other psychiatrists. The book is built around a central argument that the symbolic life is not a luxury, it is a psychological necessity. Human beings think in symbols. The capacity for symbolic thought, the ability to let one thing stand for another, to hold an image as a carrier of meaning, is as fundamental to the psyche as the capacity for language. And it runs at full power when consciousness is reduced. During sleep, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain most associated with rational sequential thought, reduces its activity. The parts of the brain associated with emotion, memory, and image-making remain active, some of them highly active. What this means, in psychological terms, is that the symbol-making capacity of the psyche runs without the editorial interference of analytical thought. This is why dreams feel so strange from the outside and so coherent from the inside. They are following a different logic, the logic of emotional resonance, of associative connection. Marie-Louise von Franz spent much of her career studying the specific symbols that appear in dreams across cultures. In her work on fairy tales, particularly the interpretation of fairy tales, published in 1970, She argued that the same symbols appear in human storytelling everywhere because they arise from the same source, the collective unconscious that Jung had described. The house that appears in a dream is rarely just a house. It stands in Jungian analysis for the structure of the psyche itself. The basement represents what lies below consciousness. The attic, the higher functions. The rooms that are locked are the things not yet examined. Joseph Campbell, the American mythologist who built much of his work on Jungian foundations, argued in The Hero with 1,000 Faces that the same symbolic journey appears in the myths of every culture that has ever existed. The departure, the trial, the return. The hero who descends, the hero who is transformed, the hero who comes back changed. This is not coincidence. It is the unconscious doing what it does, organizing experience into meaningful pattern, using the symbols it has access to. Let your body go heavy. Feel where the surface meets your back, your legs, your head. When a symbol visits you at night, in a dream, in the half-awake state, in the image that arrives just before sleep, it is not random decoration. It is the psyche choosing the most efficient carrier for something it wants to communicate. You do not need to interpret it immediately. Jung himself was skeptical of fixed dream dictionaries. He preferred a method he called amplification, holding the symbol in mind and allowing its associations to expand. The way a stone dropped in water expands outward in rings. What is this image like? What does it remind you of? These questions are not analytical, they are relational. They treat the symbol as a presence, not a puzzle. The night is full of these presences. The mind generates them without effort. You have been receiving them all your life without knowing what to do with them. You still do not have to do anything with them. Just notice that they are arriving, and that they are arriving for a reason. Chapter 11, The Persona After Dark. If you asked most people to describe themselves, they would begin with their role. I am a teacher, I am a parent, I am a manager. The role comes first, before anything else. Carl Jung was not surprised by this. He had a term for it. The persona he wrote in 2 essays on analytical psychology, published in their final form in 1928, is the name for the identity we build for social consumption. It is the selection of traits, behaviors, and presentation that we have learned over time produces the most workable version of our relationship to the external world. The persona is practical. The persona is adaptive. And in most cases, the persona works during the day. What Jung found in clinical work and in his own experience was that the persona has no real standing in the inner world. It is a social instrument. When the social context is removed, in the quiet of a house at night, in the solitary hour before sleep, the persona loses its purchase. It has no audience to address, no role to perform. And the person who has been living inside it all day is left with what was always underneath. This moment, the transition from day self to night self, is one that many people find uncomfortable without quite knowing why. Irving Goffman, the Canadian sociologist who described social life as a form of theatre in his 1956 book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, argued that we are all always, in some sense, performing. Every social interaction involves a front stage and a backstage. The front stage is the persona, the managed, presentable version. The backstage is what happens when the curtain comes down. Donald Winnicott would have said, what the performer does in the backstage is carry the accumulated effort of the day's performance. He wrote that the false self requires energy to maintain, not dramatic energy, a low, constant expenditure of attention. The attention of someone who is always slightly monitoring. Am I being seen correctly? Is this working? What does this person need from me right now? At night, that monitoring can finally stop. But the habit of it does not stop automatically. The person lies down and continues to monitor out of neurological habit, even when there is nothing left to monitor. This is one source of the restlessness that many people feel at the edge of sleep. The persona, suddenly without purpose, runs in place. Let your face relax. Let the expression you carry through the day simply go. There is no one to read it here. What is left, when the persona is not required, is something simpler and less shaped. A person before their credentials, before their accomplishments and their failures and their reputation and their role, a person who is in this moment just a body in a room, breathing, not yet asleep, not yet performing. Jung wrote that the encounter with the self, the larger self that contains both the persona and its opposite, is one of the most significant experiences available to a human being. But it cannot happen while the persona is running. It requires exactly this: the absence of audience, the removal of role, the permission to be nothing in particular for a few hours. If your mind has been drifting, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. The persona after dark is a habit without a function. You can let it go tonight. Not forever, just until morning. What remains when it is gone is not less. It is older and quieter and closer to what you actually are. Chapter 12. What the shadow protects. There is a thing that most people get wrong about the shadow, and it leads to a particular kind of suffering. They believe the shadow contains only what is bad, the aggressive impulses, the selfish desires, the parts of the self that would cause damage if they were unleashed. So they treat shadow work as a kind of confession, an admission of dark things, followed by vigilance about keeping those things suppressed. Carl Jung thought this was completely backwards. Robert Johnson, in Owning Your Own Shadow, made the argument more directly than Jung usually did. He wrote that the shadow contains not only what we judged unacceptable, but also what we judged too good for us, too brilliant, too large, too much. Many people carry in their shadow the possibility of a self they were told was arrogant to claim. The child who was genuinely talented in some domain and learned that displaying it was showing off. The adult who has a vision that feels important and has been domesticating it for 20 years because it seemed presumptuous. The person who has always wanted something and has been deciding for decades that such a want was too much to ask for. All of it goes into the shadow, the gold, as Johnson calls it, alongside the grime. What the shadow protects, then, is not only the dangerous material, it protects the unlived potential, the self you have been deciding you are not allowed to be. Jung, working with a man in his 50s, a successful engineer who had never written anything, found in the shadow of this man's self-image a buried life as a writer. The man had been told at 14 that his writing was self-indulgent. He had believed it for 40 years. The shadow had held the ambition carefully. It had never fully disappeared. It had simply been waiting. The shame of bringing this forward was real. The man wept in Jung's office, not from grief, but from the specific relief of having something named that had been unnamed for too long. This is what the shadow often holds, not monstrosity, but longing. Not darkness in the crude sense, but the darkness of the unlit room, full of things that simply have not been seen yet. Let the breath move naturally. Feel where the body is heavy, where it rests without effort. The shadow is a protective function. When the ego, the conscious self, decides something is incompatible with its self-image, the shadow carries it, safely, out of sight, waiting. The shadow does not want to destroy you. It wants to be integrated. It wants the contents it has been keeping to be brought into the light and acknowledged as yours. Not enacted without discernment, acknowledged. Acknowledgement changes everything. The impulse you name loses some of its pressure. The longing you recognize stops pressing from the wrong direction and begins pointing toward what it actually wants. What does your shadow carry tonight? Not a question to answer now, just a question to let sit the way a seed sits in the ground before anything visible happens. The shadow has been keeping something for you. It has been patient. In its way, it has been kind. Chapter 13, Overthinking as a Messenger. If you are awake at this hour, it is possible that your mind has been busy. Not with nothing, with something specific. The same ground covered twice, 3 times, 4. The same set of variables rearranged, but not resolved. Overthinking is commonly understood as a malfunction, a mind that will not stop when it is asked to stop, a system stuck in a loop. Carl Jung would not have used the word malfunction. He would have asked what the thinking is trying to find, because the loop in his framework is not random. The mind returns to the same territory not because it enjoys the territory, but because it believes something in the territory has not yet been found. Something is missing. The thinking keeps searching. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 1946, argued that much of what we call psychological distress is a signal about meaning, not a symptom of disease. When a person cannot find meaning, when the actions of their life do not connect to anything that feels significant, the psyche generates urgency, restlessness, the constant sense that something is undone. The overthinking mind is often a meaning-seeking engine that has not been given a sufficient object. This is a different diagnosis than the one most people accept. The accepted diagnosis says, your mind is dysregulated. It needs to slow down. Practice these techniques. Jung's diagnosis says, your mind is searching. What is it looking for? There is a practical layer and a deeper layer. The practical layer, overthinking loops, are often maintained by avoidance. The mind circles a decision it has not made, a conversation it has not had, a possibility it has not committed to or ruled out. The loop is the sound of incomplete information. What would break the loop is not a technique. It is a choice. Not necessarily the right choice. Any clear choice made with the information available will quiet most loops faster than any relaxation practice. The deeper layer, some overthinking, is not about a decision at all. It is about a relationship between the self and its experience. A relationship in which the self has decided it must stay alert, must stay ahead of events, must never be surprised by difficulty, because once, or more than once, being caught off guard was genuinely terrible. Jung called this the wound beneath the wound. The presenting problem pointing to something older and quieter that has never been named. Let your jaw release. Let the breath find its own pace. The overthinking that keeps you awake is not trying to make your life harder. It is trying to protect you from something it remembers was dangerous. It is loyal to a past moment with the only tools it has: vigilance, rehearsal, anticipation. If you are still awake right now, this is the part I wanted you to hear. The loop will not be solved tonight. That is not a failure. Tonight, the only useful instruction is this: whatever the mind is circling, whatever the loop is running on, it has been heard. You have been sitting with it. It does not need to escalate in order to be taken seriously. The messenger has delivered its message. The message is, something matters here. Something is unresolved. That is enough to know for now. The resolution can come in daylight. Chapter 14. The Wound Beneath Control. There is a pattern that Irvin Yalom, the American existential psychiatrist and author of Love's Executioner and Staring at the Sun, encountered repeatedly in his decades of clinical work. A patient presents with a surface problem, and then, over time, a different problem emerges. Not larger in dramatic terms, often quieter, but more specific and more painful. The surface problem is usually about control, the sense that the situation is not within the patient's management, that something is happening that they cannot shape or prevent. The wound beneath control is almost always about something older, the earliest experience of helplessness, the first time the situation was genuinely unmanageable and the consequences were genuinely painful. And the decision made then that this must never happen again. The need for control is not a character flaw. It is a survival strategy from an earlier time. Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score, documented what happens physiologically when a person feels out of control. The brain's threat detection system activates. The body prepares for emergency response. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that can reflect, evaluate, consider the past and future, begins to go offline. What remains is the reactive, survival-oriented self. Van der Kolk found that many of his patients with complex trauma histories had nervous systems that were, in effect, always at least partially in this state. Not because they were in danger, because the system had learned to treat any uncertainty as potential danger. Carl Jung understood this dynamic in the language of the psyche. He wrote that wherever we find a compulsive need for control, we find beneath it a corresponding fear of chaos, and beneath the fear of chaos, a specific memory of a time when chaos was real. Adam was 49. He had built a very successful business. He controlled what he could control and managed the rest with a precision his colleagues admired. He was not an easy person to work for, but he was a consistent one. His wife called it his armor. He called it his professionalism. The night after his business reached its 10-year anniversary, a milestone that by any measure should have felt like triumph, he lay awake and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief. An absence. He told a therapist months later that the emptiness had frightened him more than any setback. Setbacks confirmed his belief that he needed to stay alert. The emptiness had no instruction in it. He did not know what to do with an absence. What the therapist eventually found with patients was a child who had grown up in a household of unpredictable disruption, where the rules changed without notice, where what was safe yesterday was not safe today. The boy had decided, at an age when such decisions are made below the threshold of language, that if he could just stay ahead of things, he would not be caught off guard again. The adult had honored that child's decision faithfully for 4 decades. And the system had worked, in the way such systems work. He had not been caught off guard in any serious way. He had also never been fully present, because presence requires releasing the watch. Let the weight of your body settle. You do not have to guard anything right now. Jung wrote that the wound is not the problem is the response to the wound that became a permanent stance. A temporary adaptation made permanent by the passage of time and the forgetting of its origin. The wound beneath control is always the same wound in its essence. It is the wound of a self that once needed protection and never received the instruction to stand down. Tonight, no instruction is required, only rest. The watch can come down for a few hours. Nothing in this room requires guarding. Chapter 15, Dreams as Emotional Healing. In the Zurich of the 1940s, Carl Jung was seeing patients in his home at Seestrasse 228. The lake outside his window was visible from the consulting room. He had worked in that space for years, and he had developed specific practices for working with the dreams his patients brought. He did not begin by interpreting. He began by asking the patient to tell the dream, all of it, slowly, in as much detail as they could recall. He listened without interrupting. He noticed not just the content, but the affect, the tone with which the patient described each element, which parts they lingered on, where their voice changed. Then he asked, "What does each element remind you of?" Not what does it mean in a general sense, what does it remind you of specifically in your own life? This method, which he called amplification, was built on a clinical observation he made consistently over decades. The dream does not merely reflect the emotional state of the dreamer, it processes it. Marie-Louise von France, who supervised hundreds of dream analyses throughout her career and documented her findings across multiple volumes, found that patients who worked with their dreams, who took them seriously, wrote them down, spent time with them, moved through emotional difficulty faster than patients who ignored them. She attributed this to something specific. The dream does what the waking mind cannot do efficiently. It combines emotional material in new ways. It places elements that have been held in isolation alongside each other. The estranged feeling finds the relevant memory. The unnamed grief finds a symbol that holds it. Sigmund Freud called the primary process the logic of the unconscious, a form of condensation. He meant that dreams compress and combine. A single dream image can carry several layers of meaning simultaneously. This is not a defect of the dream, it is its efficiency. What Jung added to Freud's observation was the recognition that this condensation is purposeful. The unconscious is not merely disguising, it is organizing. It is looking for connections that the rational mind, trained to keep categories clean, is reluctant to make. When the same dream comes back, Jung advised patience. Not urgent decoding. The dream returns because the material has not yet moved. It is still present, still important. The return is not failure. It is persistence. Let your breath slow naturally. Notice the heaviness of your body. Whatever your emotional life holds tonight, whatever has been too large or too fast to fully feel during the day, the dreaming mind that comes after sleep will begin to work on it, without effort from you, without instruction. This is one of the things sleep does that nothing else can replicate. It gives the emotional life time in its own domain, working by its own logic, finding its own completeness. You do not have to figure anything out before you sleep. The work continues on the other side of waking, in a language that has been native to you since before you learned to speak. What arrives there will be whatever you most need to hold. Chapter 16. The Inner Child in Sleep. John Bowlby, the British psychologist who developed attachment theory in the 1950s and 1960s, made an observation that disturbed many of his contemporaries. He found that the quality of the earliest relationship between a child and their primary caregiver, the degree of attunement, safety, and responsiveness in that relationship shaped the architecture of the child's nervous system in ways that persisted into adult life. Not as memory in the ordinary sense, as pattern, as a set of expectations about what relationships do, what the self can safely expect from another person, what danger looks like, what safety feels like. These patterns, Bowlby argued, operate largely below conscious awareness. The adult who finds closeness threatening is not typically aware of the infant's experience that produced that expectation. They experience it only as a preference, a discomfort, a familiar unease that has always been there. Donald Winnicott called the earliest self, the one that formed before language, before the persona, before the child had the cognitive capacity to reflect on its own experience, the true self. And he was careful to say that this self does not disappear in adulthood. It goes underground. It retreats behind the adaptive self that learned to manage the world. But it continues to exist, and it continues to make its needs known, often in indirect ways. Carl Jung wrote about what he called the child archetype, not the literal inner child of popular psychology, but a symbolic figure that appears in dreams and in the psyche as a representation of potentiality, of beginning, of the self before it was shaped by experience. The child archetype represents what is still becoming, what has not yet found its form. When the child archetype appears in dreams, the small figure in need of protection, the lost child the dreamer cannot find, Jung read this as a communication about unlived potentiality. Some part of the self is still waiting to develop. Helena, who had retired from her career in project management and spent the first months of retirement feeling invisible, began to have recurring dreams of a small girl standing in a room full of art supplies that no one had touched. The girl was not distressed. She was waiting, quietly. Helena knew immediately what the dream was about. She had known for 40 years that she had wanted to draw. She had been very talented as a child. Her 5th grade teacher had told her she should pursue it. Her parents, practical people who had worked hard for stability, had explained that art was not practical. She had agreed with them. She had been agreeing with them ever since. The small girl in the dream was not accusing anyone. She was simply still there, still waiting. Let the jaw go soft. Feel the breath moving without effort. Bowlby's research showed that the patterns laid down in early attachment do not disappear, but they are not fixed. They can change. What changes them is not primarily insight, the intellectual understanding of where the pattern came from. What changes them is a new experience of safety, a new relationship with oneself that demonstrates repeatedly and concretely that the original expectation is no longer accurate. Sleep is in its way one of those demonstrations. In sleep, the vigilant self relaxes. The body rests without monitoring. The need to perform, to manage, to be someone in particular is suspended. What remains in sleep is something closer to the original self, the one that existed before the shaping began, the one that is still, in its quiet way, waiting for permission to become more fully what it was always going to be. That permission does not require a dramatic moment. It requires only the recognition that the wait is not permanent, that what has been held in reserve has not expired. The girl in the dream is still in the room. The supplies are still there. Chapter 17, projection, and night anxiety. There is a particular form of late-night anxiety that is not about the future. It is not about the project deadline or the conversation scheduled for tomorrow. It is about a person. Someone who has done something that will not leave your mind, whose behavior keeps arriving, replayed and analyzed until you have constructed a detailed portrait of their flaw. Carl Jung called this phenomenon projection, and he considered it one of the most important dynamics in psychological life. Projection, in the Jungian understanding, is the act of placing a quality of your own psyche onto another person, and then responding to that quality as if it belonged entirely to them. The quality is usually shadow material, something you have identified as unacceptable in yourself and therefore cannot own consciously. Finding it in another person allows you to feel the emotion attached to it without having to acknowledge that the quality exists in you at all. This is why the things that disturb us most in other people often disturb us in a way that seems disproportionate to the actual offense. Sigmund Freud described projection in similar terms as a defense mechanism, a way of externalizing internal conflict. Jung agreed with the mechanics but drew a different implication. Freud saw projection as something to be dissolved through insight. Jung saw it as something that, when dissolved, returns valuable self-knowledge. What you find when you take back a projection is a piece of your own psyche returned. Alfred Adler, who developed his own school of psychology in Vienna in the early 20th century, approached the same phenomenon from a different angle. He wrote that the person who is chronically irritated by the behavior of others is often a person who is not attending to their own dissatisfactions. The man who cannot stop being furious about his colleague's laziness may be a man who has never allowed himself to rest. The woman who finds her sister's openness about her struggles embarrassing may be a woman who has learned to find her own need for support shameful. Notice the breath. Let the body be heavy. Night anxiety that centers on other people, the replaying of their behavior, the construction of their flaw, has a useful instruction in it if we are willing to receive it. The instruction is not, look at what is wrong with them. The instruction is, look at what is activated in you, not accusatorially. Jung did not believe in self-blame as a useful psychological practice. He believed in self-knowledge. These are different things. Taking back a projection does not mean excusing the behavior that triggered it. Other people can genuinely behave badly. The projection observation is about the specific quality of the emotional charge, the intensity, the persistence, the 3 a.m. return that suggests something personal is involved. What does this person represent for you? What quality in them have you been deciding you do not have? These questions do not require immediate answers. They require only a gentle curiosity, the recognition that the thing that has followed you to bed tonight is not entirely about the person you are thinking about. Some of it is about you, and that part at least you have the power to look at. Chapter 18. The Archetype of the Stranger. In every significant myth and fairy tale from the world's storytelling traditions, there is a figure who arrives from outside. The stranger who appears at the door. The wanderer who brings news. the traveler from a distant country who carries something the community does not have. James Hillman, the American depth psychologist and author of Revisioning Psychology, spent his career insisting that mythological figures are not relics of primitive thinking, but accurate descriptions of psychological states. The stranger who arrives in the myth is a description of something that happens in the psyche. Something from outside the familiar territory of consciousness appears, and the question is whether it will be welcomed or turned away. Carl Jung called this the encounter with the unconscious. He described it as one of the most reliable turning points in psychological life. Not always comfortable, but reliable. The stranger, as an archetype, appears in several forms. Sometimes it is a dream figure, someone the dreamer does not recognize, who nevertheless feels significant. Sometimes it is an idea that arrives with unusual force and does not belong to the person's ordinary way of thinking. Sometimes it is a feeling that has no precedent, a grief that seems too large for the circumstances, a joy that seems unearned. Joseph Campbell, drawing on Jung's framework in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, noted that the hero's journey always begins with an encounter with the unknown, and the first response is almost always refusal. The call is heard and rejected. The stranger is turned away. This refusal is not weakness. It is the normal response of a self that has achieved a stable organization and is reluctant to disturb it. Stability is hard won. The stranger, the new material, the new possibility, the new demand threatens it. But the call returns. In Campbell's analysis, the call always returns. What does the stranger represent for you in this period of your life? Not as a literal figure, but as a direction, something that has been appearing at the edge of your awareness that you have not yet fully turned toward. Let the breath be easy. Let the body rest without effort. There is a quieter version of this dynamic that Jung noticed in the later stages of life, what he called the afternoon of life, by which he meant the years after midlife. In the first half of life, the task is construction, building a self, a place in the world, relationships and roles that constitute a life. The stranger, in this phase, is often a disruption to be managed. In the second half of life, the stranger becomes an invitation. The values that built the first half of life begin to feel insufficient. Something else is asking for attention. Something older, less definable, more interior. This is not crisis, Jung thought. This is the natural expansion of the self if the person is willing to let it happen. The stranger at the door is not a threat. It is the self arriving from a direction you did not expect. If it has been knocking, it will continue to knock. Tonight, you do not have to open the door. You only have to acknowledge that you hear the knock. Chapter 19, When the Psyche Splits. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body and nothing to do with how much sleep you have gotten. It is the exhaustion of living in contradiction, of holding simultaneously a version of yourself that you present to the world, and a version of yourself that knows this is not the whole story. Carl Jung had a clinical name for the more severe versions of this split. He called it dissociation. But he understood that dissociation exists on a spectrum, from the extreme fragmentation seen in serious psychiatric conditions, all the way down to the mild and common experience of functioning in one's public role while a different, quieter self waits for the room to empty. Pierre Janet, the French psychologist who worked in Paris in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was one of the first to study psychological dissociation systematically. He observed that the self can divide along lines of overwhelming experience, that something too large for the psyche to integrate can be, in effect, partitioned, held separate from ordinary consciousness, available only under certain conditions. Jung read Janet's work and extended it. He observed that even without trauma in the clinical sense, the psyche commonly holds several complexes, organized clusters of experience and emotion that do not always communicate with each other. The complex associated with work does not always know what the complex associated with love knows. Erich Neumann, in The Origins and History of Consciousness, described this as the price of civilization. The development of a coherent, functional ego requires a degree of suppression of everything that does not fit the ego's project. The cost is a self that is simultaneously capable and partial. The psyche splits not out of failure, but out of efficiency. And the split, carried long enough, becomes the source of a specific suffering. You can feel it as a vague sense of inauthenticity, as the feeling that you are watching your own life from a slight distance, as the persistence of a low-level flatness even in moments that should feel full, as the difficulty of knowing when asked what you actually want. These are symptoms of the same thing, the self in conversation only with its partial version, not with its whole. Let the breath be what it is. Feel the weight of the body. Jung wrote that the goal of psychological work is not adjustment, learning to live more comfortably within the partial self. It is integration, the gradual, uncomfortable, worthwhile process of bringing the parts into conversation with each other. This is slow work. It is not the work of a single night, but it is work that can begin in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it begins in a dream that cannot be explained. Sometimes it begins here, in the quiet, in the dark, in the moment when the performance has been suspended and the exhausted self can finally stop holding its position and simply rest. Whatever has been held in partition does not need to arrive all at once. The psyche is not asking for a confrontation. It is asking, in its patient way, for a beginning. That beginning can be as small as the recognition, in this room, in this hour, that you are more than what you have been performing. That is enough to start. Chapter 20. The Cost of Perfectionism. Marion Woodman was a Canadian Jungian analyst who worked primarily with questions of the body, the feminine psyche, and the inner experience of people who had grown up in environments where performance was the primary currency of love. She wrote in Addiction to Perfection, published in 1982, that perfectionism is not a high standard. It is a defense, and like all defenses, it was constructed in response to a specific threat, usually the threat of conditional love. The implicit message, you will be acceptable when you are perfect. And because perfection is definitionally unattainable, the message becomes, you will never quite be acceptable. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American psychologist who developed the concept of flow, the state of optimal engagement that occurs when challenge and skill are precisely matched, found something interesting when he studied the relationship between perfectionism and performance. Perfectionists often perform well on narrow tasks in controlled conditions and significantly underperform in open-ended conditions. Because open-ended conditions require tolerance for ambiguity, and perfectionism is at its core intolerance for the imperfect moment. Carl Jung saw perfectionism as a manifestation of what he called the puer aeternus, the eternal youth in its shadow form. The puer aeternus in its shadow refuses to commit to anything that might produce a result that is less than ideal, because a less than ideal result would be evidence of the thing the perfectionist most fears, that they are, at their core, insufficient. The demand for a perfect result is a demand that the self not be exposed. As long as the work is not complete, the self cannot be judged. The perfectionist is often not lazy. They are terrified. Let the jaw release. Let the breath move on its own. The cost of perfectionism is specific and high. It is not primarily the cost of unfinished work or missed deadlines. It is the cost of a self that cannot be present in imperfect moments, which are all moments. The child who was praised only for achievement and never for existence grows into an adult who does not know how to rest without producing, who cannot eat a meal without considering whether it is the right meal, who cannot have a conversation without reviewing afterward how it could have been better. This is not happiness, and it is not actually excellence. It is a performance of control that never quite reaches the satisfaction it promises, because the satisfaction promised is not available within the logic of perfectionism. It would require being enough as you are. Jung's prescription, quieter than most prescriptions, was individuation. The slow process of becoming more fully what you actually are, rather than what you have decided you must be. Not the abandonment of standards, but the replacement of the external standard with something internal. The question not of, is this good enough, but of, is this mine? The difference is not small. The first question answers to an audience. The second answers to something that lives in the same place as whatever you most care about. Nothing in this room tonight asks for your performance. Nothing here needs you to be excellent. You can be imprecise, uncertain, half asleep, exactly as you are. This is, for many people, the most difficult instruction, and the most necessary one. Chapter 21, Depression and Lost Meaning. In 1961, Viktor Frankl gave a lecture in San Francisco in which he described what he called the existential vacuum. He observed that large numbers of people in industrialized societies were experiencing a specific kind of suffering that was not adequately explained by the categories of clinical psychology. They were not traumatized in any obvious way. They were not suffering from diagnosable illness. They had, in many measurable respects, good lives. And yet they felt that something was missing. Not something specific that could be named and therefore sought, something structural. A sense that their lives, however comfortable, were not pointing toward anything. Frankl called this the existential vacuum. He believed it was the primary source of much of the depression, anxiety, and restlessness he saw increasing around him. Carl Jung had made a related observation 30 years earlier. He wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, published in 1933, that the great problem of his clinical work was not neurosis in the technical sense. It was the problem of people who had achieved everything they set out to achieve, and found, on the other side of achievement, an unexpected emptiness. He estimated that more than a third of his patients were suffering not from any clinically definable condition, but from the senselessness and aimlessness of their lives. Irvin Yalom, writing in Staring at the Sun about his work with older patients confronting mortality, found the same pattern from a different angle. Many of the patients who found death most frightening were those who felt most acutely that they had not yet fully lived. Not that they had made mistakes, that they had lived at a remove from their own experience. That the life had happened, but they had not been quite present in it. The connection between depression and lost meaning is something that medication can partially address, and activity can temporarily relieve. What neither can replace is the experience of mattering, of feeling that what one does has significance beyond the immediate. Let the body rest, feel the weight of it. Nothing is required of you here. The meaning that Frankl described was not found in grand purposes or dramatic missions. He observed, from his experience in the concentration camps, that people survived the unsurvivable when they had something to live for, something specific and personal. A child waiting, a manuscript to complete, a person who needed them. The meaning did not have to be large, it had to be real. Jung's version of this was what he called the second half of life, the period in which the tasks of the first half naturally give way to questions of depth and interiority. What has this life been about? What has been left undone? What does the self most essentially want, underneath the desire for success and approval? These are not comfortable questions, but they are not morbid ones. They are the questions that lead, when followed with patience, toward a more specifically inhabited life. The depression that accompanies lost meaning is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of a self that knows, at some level, that something important is being missed, and is generating the feeling of urgency that it has available. The feeling is uncomfortable. The feeling is also correct. What it is pointing at is worth finding. Chapter 22. Loneliness in the Inner World. There is an inner loneliness that has nothing to do with whether you are surrounded by people. It is the loneliness of a self that has never been fully known, not by others, and often not by itself. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who lived much of his adult life in solitude, in boarding houses in Sils Maria, in Turin, in Nice, described this in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published in 1883. He gave his protagonist a speech in which he says that the greatest loneliness is not the absence of company. It is the absence of recognition, the feeling of being seen only partially from the outside by people who are looking at the wrong things. Carl Jung understood this intimately. He was, by his own account, a man who lived in two worlds throughout his life: the outer world of professional accomplishment, family, and social regard, and an inner world of image, dream, and symbol that he rarely shared with anyone. He wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that from his earliest childhood he had felt this split. He described two presences in himself: the social child who attended school and played with friends, and the inner child who lived in a timeless, vast interior landscape. He wrote that most people he encountered were entirely the first, and that he had spent much of his life feeling, in some fundamental way, unknown. This is the inner loneliness, not the loneliness of being without people, the loneliness of being with people and still not being known, of performing, however authentically, a version of yourself that leaves the most essential part unreached. Do you remember the two kinds of tiredness we mentioned at the beginning? This is the second one. Not the tiredness of the body, the tiredness of a self that has been performing even in intimate relationships, that has never found the person or the context in which the whole of it could be present. This tiredness is real, and it is one of the things that makes the night feel heavy. The accumulated weight of a day of being seen partially. Feel the breath. Let the body be still. The cure for inner loneliness is not, Jung found, primarily in other people, though other people can participate in it. The first movement is internal, the development of a relationship with the inner life. The dreams, the images, the feelings that are not yet language. That creates a kind of inner companionship. This sounds abstract. It is, in practice, very concrete. It is what happens when you write in a journal and something true appears that you did not know you were going to say. It is what happens when you spend an hour in a garden without a phone. It is what happens in the moments just before sleep, when the noise clears and something quieter and more essential becomes, briefly, audible. Inner loneliness does not end tonight, but it is less total in this moment than it may have been an hour ago, because you have been, for the last while, in a kind of company. The company of ideas that take you seriously. The company of thinkers who also felt what you feel and thought it worth spending a life on. That is not nothing. In some hours, it is considerable. Chapter 23, The Fear of Becoming Whole. It is one of the more surprising discoveries in psychological work, the fear of getting better. Patients come to therapy wanting to change, and they mean it. And then, as change becomes possible, as the old defenses soften and the habitual patterns become visible and the alternative begins to take shape, something resists, something pulls back. The improvement stalls, or is sabotaged, or generates anxiety that seems entirely disproportionate to the progress. Carl Jung called this enantiodromia, a Greek term he borrowed from Heraclitus, meaning the tendency of things to become their opposites. He observed that when a person has been organized around a particular way of being for a long time, the prospect of its dissolution feels like the dissolution of the self, even when the way of being has been painful. Edward Edinger, the American Jungian analyst and author of Ego and Archetype, published in 1972, spent much of his career studying this dynamic. He wrote that the ego, the conscious organizing self, has a legitimate fear of the process of individuation. Because individuation requires the ego to relinquish its position as the sole authority of the psyche, to acknowledge the unconscious as a collaborator, not a subordinate. This is genuinely threatening in psychological terms. The ego does not always know, in the moment of being asked to loosen, that what is on the other side is not dissolution, but expansion. What it knows is, this is different from what I have always been. And what has always been is, at minimum, survivable. The fear of becoming whole is not irrational. It is the legitimate fear of a self that has adapted to a limited identity and knows that the larger identity, however more complete, will require a period of being not yet arrived. A transition in which the old self has partially dissolved and the new self has not yet fully taken form. In mythology, this is the death and rebirth motif. The hero who descends into the underworld faces what is there and returns changed, not because the darkness was comfortable, because the passage through it produced something that could not have been reached by staying on the surface. Let the breath be easy. Let the weight of the body settle. Jung wrote that wholeness is not an achievement, it is a recognition. The self that becomes whole does not acquire new qualities. It recovers and integrates the qualities it always had but could not yet hold. The fear is real. The cost of wholeness is real. The old self has to loosen, in some sense, for the new self to have room. This is not pleasant. But the alternative, the self that remains partial, that circles the same territory, that keeps the same distance from its own depth, indefinitely, has its own cost. A cost spread over time rather than concentrated in a moment of transition. You do not have to become whole tonight. No one becomes whole in a night. But you can allow yourself in this room to be somewhat less defended than you were this morning, somewhat more willing to hold what is there. That is the beginning of the only thing that counts. Chapter 24, Individuation, begins quietly. The word individuation in Jung's vocabulary does not mean individualism. It does not mean becoming more separate from others, more self-sufficient in the familiar cultural sense. It means becoming more fully what you specifically are. Not what culture says a person should be, not what your upbringing optimized you to be, not what your professional role requires, or your relational role allows, or your own ambitions have decided is the right version. What you specifically, irreducibly, essentially are, underneath and despite and through all of those shapings. Jung introduced the term in its technical sense in Psychological Types, published in 1921. He used it to describe the process by which the psyche moves over the course of a life toward its own completeness, not toward perfection, completeness, the incorporation of what has been excluded, the recognition of what has been denied, the making real of what has been merely potential. It is a lifelong process. It cannot be completed. It can only be continued. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen monk and author of The Miracle of Mindfulness and Peace is Every Step, described something adjacent to this in the language of his tradition. He wrote that the work of a human life is not the attainment of some distant state. It is the progressive deepening of one's presence in the life already being lived, the discovery, moment by moment, of what is already here. This convergence between Jung's Western depth psychology and the Eastern tradition of present moment awareness is not accidental. Both describe the same movement from the constructed self toward the actual self. Individuation begins quietly because it cannot begin loudly. The ego, which controls the means of loud beginning, is precisely what the process asks to step back. It begins in the moments when you are not trying, when the performance has stopped and something quieter has space, when a dream visits that you did not plan, when a feeling arrives that does not fit your self-image, when you read something or hear something that lands in a place you did not know was waiting. This may be one of those moments, not dramatically, not with consequence, just an hour in which some ideas from a man who spent 60 years listening have been moving through the quiet. Let your breath slow. Feel the weight of the body, the contact with the surface beneath you. The room is still. Individuation does not require a therapist, though a therapist can help. It does not require a dramatic event, though dramatic events often accelerate it. It does not even require deliberate effort, though attention helps. What it requires is simply this: a willingness to notice. To notice what is actually felt, not what should be felt. To notice what is actually wanted, not what is appropriate to want. To notice what the dreams say, not what the daylight dismisses. This noticing, accumulated over time, slowly changes things, not dramatically, in the way that water changes stone, not by force, but by persistence. You have been, tonight, paying attention to ideas that take the inner life seriously, to the quiet that lives beneath the noise. Individuation began the first time you listened to that weight and did not immediately dismiss it. It may have begun a long time ago. Chapter 25. The Soul Beneath Thought. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist who taught at Harvard from the 1870s until 1907, believed that the self was not a thing, it was a process. A continuous stream of experience that gives the appearance of a unified subject through the coherence of memory and habit, not through the existence of some essential core. He called it the stream of consciousness, a phrase that entered both psychology and literature and stayed there. Carl Jung read James carefully and agreed with the phenomenology while disagreeing with the conclusion. For Jung, the stream of consciousness was real. The continuous flow of experience was accurately described. But he did not believe it was all there was. Below the stream, Jung argued there was a depth. Not another stream, but something more like the ocean beneath the river's surface. Vast, largely still, containing material that the river above does not have access to and does not know is there. He called this the collective unconscious, and he distinguished it from what Freud had called the unconscious, which was, in Freud's model, primarily the repository of the individual's repressed personal material. For Jung, the personal unconscious was real and important, but it floated above something even larger, a shared substrate of human experience containing the patterns and images that have been part of human psychological life since before recorded history. This was not mysticism, Jung insisted. It was an empirical observation from clinical work. The same images, the same symbolic patterns appeared in the dreams and fantasies of people across cultures, across eras, across any obvious explanatory link. Something was being generated by a common source. Whether or not one accepts the full architecture of the collective unconscious, Jung's clinical observation holds. Beneath the layer of personal experience, there is something that feels impersonal. Something that arrives not as my thought, but as a thought that moves through me. Something that feels less like production and more like reception. This is what mystics in every tradition have tried to describe. This is what the contemplative traditions have built practices around reaching. This is what some people touch in the moment just before sleep, when the personal self loosens its hold and something larger becomes briefly audible. Let the breath be what it is. Let the body rest without help from you. Jung wrote, late in his life, that the soul is not something a person has, it is something a person participates in. An ancient, shared inheritance that shows up in the particular life, in these specific dreams, this specific longing, this specific quality of feeling. But that belongs to something larger than the individual. He did not use the word soul lightly. He was a scientist, and he was careful with language. But he found it was the most accurate word for what he was trying to describe. The depth dimension of the person. The part that does not belong entirely to the individual history, but opens onto something wider. Whatever that is, whatever name one gives it, it is present in this hour. It is present whenever a human being goes still enough to feel what lies beneath the thinking. Thought is real. The soul beneath thought is also real. Both are here tonight. The thinking mind will rest soon. What remains when it does is not absence, it is presence of a different kind. Chapter 26. Restlessness and Repressed Feeling. The body that will not settle is almost always a body that has been given something to carry. This is one of Bessel van der Kolk's central observations. In The Body Keeps the Score, he documents case after case of individuals whose nervous systems remain in a state of readiness, unable to fully rest, unable to fully release, not because of any structural fault, but because of experience that was never fully processed. Experience that arrived too fast, or too overwhelming, or in circumstances where response was impossible, and that has been held in the body's tissue ever since. The restless night is, in many cases, the body trying to process what the day did not have room for. Donald Winnicott, working with a different patient population, described a related phenomenon. He observed that children who had learned to suppress emotional response, who had been raised in environments where feeling was too disruptive or too dangerous to express, did not lose their capacity to feel. They lost their capacity to recognize what they were feeling. The feeling went underground, but it did not go away. It showed up as physical tension, as restlessness, as a low-level agitation that the child, and later the adult, could not attribute to anything specific. Carl Jung had a broader frame for this. He wrote that the psyche does not tolerate suppression indefinitely. What is pushed below the threshold of consciousness does not stay there passively. It generates pressure. It looks for alternative exits. It arrives in dreams, in physical symptoms, in the irrational emotional reactions that confuse even their owner. Repressed feeling is not weakness. It is the normal consequence of living in circumstances that made certain feelings dangerous or unwelcome. The feeling was appropriate to the situation. The situation did not permit its expression, so the feeling went somewhere else. What happens to it in there? It waits. It does not age. It does not update itself with new information. The grief that was too dangerous to feel at 30 is still 30's grief at 50. It has not become the grief of a person who has since learned that grief is survivable. It is still the grief of the person who had not yet learned that. This is why old feelings, when they finally surface, can feel disproportionate, can feel embarrassingly large. They belong to an earlier self who had less capacity to hold them. Let the body be heavy. Feel where it rests. Nothing is required here. The restlessness tonight, if it is present, is a sign that something has not yet been put down. Not a failure of technique, not an inadequacy of effort, just an accumulation of feeling that needed a safe place to exist. This room is a safe place. This dark, this quiet, this hour with no performance required, these are the conditions in which accumulated feeling can begin to soften, not to be analyzed, not to be fixed, just to breathe. If something rises in you tonight, some feeling without a clear object, some pressure without a clear location, you do not have to identify it. You do not have to explain it. You only have to let it be present without fighting it. What the body has been holding does not need to be resolved to release. It needs only a place where holding it is no longer necessary. This is that place. For tonight, you can set it down, Chapter 27. The Dream You Avoid. Marie-Louise von Franz, in her later work on dreams and the unconscious, identified a pattern she called the avoided dream. It was not the dream the patient forgot, it was the dream the patient remembered and did not bring. The one described briefly and then moved past quickly, as if it were less interesting than the others. The one that provoked a quick dismissal, just a strange dream, probably nothing. Von Franz found that these were often the most important ones. The avoided dream carries material that the conscious mind is most resistant to receiving, not because the material is violent or disturbing in any obvious way, often because it is clarifying, and the clarity is unwelcome. Carl Jung wrote that one of the most common manifestations of the avoided dream is the dream that simply states the truth, not in dramatic or symbolic terms, just with the directness the dreaming mind occasionally achieves, says what the waking mind has been refusing to say. The man who is in the wrong profession dreams of sitting at a different desk in a different building, feeling entirely at ease, and wakes with a feeling of loss he cannot explain and does not pursue. The woman who has stayed in a relationship out of obligation rather than love dreams of standing alone on a large open plain, feeling unburdened for the first time in the dream world, and wakes and immediately begins thinking about logistics. These dreams are not prescriptions. They are not instructions to leave the job or leave the relationship. They are simply reports. They are the unconscious stating without judgment what is also true. The avoidance of these reports is understandable. The implications are uncomfortable. If the dream is acknowledged, the knowledge in it enters the waking conversation, and then something may have to change. Or, at minimum, the pretense that nothing needs to change becomes harder to maintain. But the dream that is avoided does not dissolve. It returns. In the same or different costume, with the same or different characters, always in the same direction. Because the unconscious does not abandon what it has found relevant. Von Franz's prescription was not to act on the dream immediately. It was to write it down, to sit with it, to let it be a part of the conversation with oneself rather than data quickly discarded. Feel the breath. Let the body be quiet. There may be a dream in your recent memory that you moved past quickly, that you described to no one, that you dismissed as too obvious, too strange, too personal, too uncomfortable. If so, you do not have to do anything with it now. But it is worth noticing that it has stayed with you, that even in the process of dismissing it, it left something behind. The unconscious is remarkably patient. It will present the material again when the time is better. It has no attachment to your readiness. But it does not give up. What you have been avoiding knowing may be the very thing your life is currently organized around not knowing, and that is, in its way, the most important thing to know. Chapter 28. The Unlived Life Within. James Hillman, writing in The Soul's Code in 1996, introduced a concept he called the acorn theory. He borrowed the metaphor from the Platonic tradition, but developed it in a specifically Jungian direction. The acorn theory proposes that each person arrives in the world with a specific character, a particular shape, a particular set of potentials that the life is meant to unfold. This is not destiny in the fatalistic sense. It is more like a seed's relationship to its eventual form. The seed does not determine every circumstance, but it has an inherent direction. The unlived life, in Hillman's understanding, is not primarily what was taken away. It is what was never given permission. The potential that was deemed impractical or inappropriate or too much or not enough. The self that did not get to develop because the circumstances of the life did not provide the conditions for it. Carl Jung called this the unlived life in direct terms. He wrote that it is one of the most frequent sources of psychological suffering in midlife and beyond. The accumulation of unacted upon possibilities, building pressure the way gas builds in a sealed container. The unlived life does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes the quality of melancholy that visits on Sunday afternoons. The longing that arrives when you see someone doing something you never let yourself try. The mild and persistent ache of the road not taken, not in regret exactly, but in the specific awareness of what the other direction might have held. A woman of 63 had always meant to learn an instrument. She had studied piano briefly as a child and been told she had no gift for it. This was probably true in the narrow sense that gift is usually measured technical facility, competitive potential. But what she had experienced in those early lessons before the verdict arrived was something she had not found anywhere else in 40 years. A particular quality of absorption, a particular quality of being entirely present. She had filed it under things I did not get to do. At 63, she bought a small keyboard. She did not expect to play well. She did not. But the quality of absorption returned immediately. And with it, something she recognized, belatedly, as herself. Let the breath be easy. Let the body rest. The unlived life is not lost. This is the thing most people do not know, or know and do not believe. It is not lost. It is waiting, as it has always been waiting, with the specific patience of things that belong to the core of a person rather than to their circumstances. What has not yet been begun can still be begun. What has not yet been expressed can still be expressed. The instrument that was never picked up, the language that was never learned. Land, the relationship with a part of the self that was never cultivated. None of this requires a dramatic gesture. It requires only the recognition that the unlived life is still alive, that the seed is still the seed, that the oak it was always meant to become has not become a different tree just because the growing was slow. What has been waiting for you is still there. It will be there in the morning. Chapter 29. Forgiveness of the hidden self. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in a tent at the Danube frontier in the year 170 CE, returned repeatedly to a single question. Not what must be done, not what must be achieved, what must be let go. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he found it necessary to remind himself each morning that the person he had been yesterday was not the person he had to be today. That the failures of the previous week, the moments of irritability, the impatience, the failure to live up to his own principles were not permanent verdicts. They were information. Carl Jung made a similar observation from the clinical side. He noticed that the patients who made the least psychological progress were not the ones who resisted insight. They were the ones who, upon receiving insight, turned it immediately into self-accusation, who learned something true about themselves and then punished themselves for the truth. This is the opposite of integration. Integration requires a fundamental orientation of interest rather than judgment toward one's own interior. Forgiveness of the hidden self is not permission for harmful behavior. It is not the claim that everything you have done or failed to do was acceptable. It is more precise than that. It is the recognition that the hidden self, the shadow, the persona, the complex, the repressed feeling, the unlived life, developed in response to real circumstances, real constraints, real threats, some of them very early, that produced adaptations that have cost you something and are still costing you, and that were nonetheless the best responses available at the time with the resources available at the time. The child who learned to suppress feeling was not weak. They were adapting to a situation in which feeling was dangerous. The adult who has been running the same suppression for 40 years is not weak either. They are loyal to a system that once kept them safe. The system is no longer necessary, but the loyalty is understandable. Jung wrote that one cannot come to terms with the shadow through moral force. Condemning the shadow does not integrate it, it drives it deeper and makes it more powerful. What integrates the shadow is light, which is to say, awareness. And awareness requires a quality of self-regard that is closer to curiosity than to judgment. Let the body be easy. Let the breath be its own. The hidden self you have been managing all your life, the parts of you that were exiled, the potentials that were suppressed, the feelings that were not permitted, did not choose to go underground, they were sent there. By the logic of your particular circumstances, by the people who shaped your early world, by your own decisions made in good faith with limited information, they deserve, at minimum, a fair hearing. Not tonight, there is no urgency. But the orientation, the turning toward the hidden self with curiosity rather than condemnation, can begin in a very small way. In the same way that Aurelius reminded himself each morning not to carry yesterday's verdict into today, you can remind yourself in this quiet that the things you have not been able to look at are waiting not for punishment, but for recognition. Recognition is what they have always been waiting for. It is the simplest form of forgiveness, and it is available even now, even in the dark. Chapter 30. Consciousness learns to listen. There is a story Carl Jung told in a seminar in Zurich in 1934. A woman came to him after many years of suffering what she described as an inexplicable emptiness. She was educated, accomplished, socially connected. She had tried various treatments. She was, by any external measure, a person who should have been fine. Jung asked her to describe her days. She described a life of continuous activity. Morning to evening, she moved from one task to the next. There was always something to do, someone to see, something to prepare for. She moved through it efficiently. She was good at the activity. Jung asked, "And when do you stop?" She said she did not particularly like stopping. He said, "Yes, that is the problem." He was not prescribing idleness. He was prescribing listening. The difference is important. The consciousness that never stops is the consciousness that never receives. It produces, it manages, it performs, it arranges, but it does not listen to what is coming from below. It does not hear the dreams. It does not notice the patterns. It does not feel the pressure that the unconscious is generating, because it is always too busy running in a different direction. Robert Johnson, in Inner Work, published in 1986, and one of the most practical guides to applying Jungian ideas to daily life, wrote that the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious is genuinely relationship. It requires both parties to participate. The unconscious sends material continuously, in dreams, in emotional tones, in the images that arise spontaneously, in the body's unexplained states. But if consciousness does not turn toward this material and attend to it, the relationship becomes one-directional. One-directional relationships, in any domain, eventually produce crisis. The crisis is usually the moment when the unconscious material that has been ignored generates enough pressure to break through in a form that can no longer be ignored. An illness, a depression, a dream too vivid to dismiss, a compulsive behavior that will not respond to willpower. Jung called this the transcendent function, the movement from a one-sided consciousness toward a more complete relationship with the psyche as a whole. It can be sought deliberately through practices that invite the unconscious to speak, active imagination, dream work, sustained reflection, or it can be provoked by crisis. The voluntary path is less dramatic and less expensive. Let the breath come and go on its own. Let the body rest without adjustment. Consciousness learning to listen is not a single event. It is a reorientation, a change in the fundamental direction of attention from exclusively outward to including inward. Not withdrawal from the world, not the abandonment of function, just the addition of a second channel of information that has been there all along and has been largely ignored. You have been, for the past hours, doing something that resembles this. Letting ideas from the inner life move through the attention, without needing to produce an output, without needing to arrive at a conclusion. This is what listening looks like. The unconscious has been speaking to you all your life. It has been speaking tonight. Not in sentences, in the quality of your attention, in what lands and what passes through, in what the body does in response to certain ideas. You do not have to know what it said. You only have to know it was speaking, and that you were for a while, listening. Chapter 31. The symbol becomes a door. Erich Neumann. In The Great Mother, published in 1955. Traced the symbolic history of a single archetype across cultures and millennia. The Great Mother, the goddess of birth, of earth, of death, of transformation. She appears in the Neolithic figurines unearthed across Europe. She appears in the Egyptian Isis, in the Greek Demeter, in the Hindu Kali. She appears barely secularized in the imagery of much contemporary visual culture. She is not the same in every appearance. She is recognizably related. Neumann's argument was that the symbol is not an explanation. It is a pointer. It directs attention towards something in the psyche that cannot be stated directly, that can only be approached through image. Carl Jung had developed this argument across decades of work with patients whose dreams and fantasies contained symbols they had no cultural exposure to. A German factory worker in the 1920s who had never studied mythology dreamed of a sun god figure with attributes that matched the Egyptian Ra in specific and startling ways. A Swiss schoolteacher produced in active imagination a figure who spoke in the language of medieval alchemy without any awareness of alchemical texts. Jung did not conclude these patients had accessed some supernatural source. He concluded that the psyche has a deep structure, a layer that is not personal, that is older than the individual, and that has access to images and patterns that belong to the species rather than to the self. When a symbol arrives, in a dream, in a moment of quiet, in the sudden recognition of an image that seems to carry more weight than its surface, it is becoming a door, a portal through which the deeper layer of the psyche is attempting to communicate. The door does not open by force. It opens by attention, by the willingness to hold the symbol in the way that Jung described, staying with it, letting it reveal itself, not demanding of it an immediate and rational explanation. Let the body rest. Feel the weight of it. The room is quiet. The symbols of your inner life are your own. No one else's set of images will open your particular doors. The symbol that carries charge for you, that returns, that lands with a weight other symbols do not have, is the one worth attending. It may be an image from a recurring dream. It may be the quality of light in a memory from childhood. It may be an object that has always meant more than its function. It may be something that arrived in the last few hours, an image that attached itself to one of the ideas we have been moving through. These are not decorations, they are communications. And the most important thing you can do with them is not decode them. It is to let them stay. Let them be present. Let them work on you in the way that symbols work, not by explaining anything, but by opening something. A door that has been closed for a long time does not open all at once. It opens first by a crack, then by a little more. The crack is enough for tonight. The light from the other side does not need to flood in. It only needs to be visible. You can see it from here. Chapter 32. Shadow Work Without Force. There is a version of shadow work that has become popular in the form of self-help, a project of intense, scheduled confrontation with the darker aspects of the self. Journaling exercises designed to surface the shadow on demand. Workshops, intensive retreats, the shadow as a productivity target. Jung would not have recognized this approach, and he would have had reservations about it. Marion Woodman, who spent decades doing shadow work with patients, particularly people whose relationship with their bodies and their early experience of care had been distorted, wrote that the shadow does not respond to force. It responds to relationship. You cannot make the shadow reveal itself on schedule. You cannot demand that it produce its contents for examination. The shadow is not a filing cabinet. It is a psychological reality with its own timing, its own sense of when the environment is safe enough for its contents to emerge. What creates that safety is not technique. It is a quality of inner relationship, a relationship with oneself characterized by curiosity rather than judgment, by interest rather than agenda, by a willingness to receive what comes rather than to extract what is wanted. Carl Jung's approach to shadow material in clinical practice was, by contemporary standards, remarkably slow. He worked with some patients for many years. He trusted the psyche's own timing. He described his approach in terms of witnessing, being present with what arose, rather than directing it. He was influenced in this by the alchemical tradition, which he studied intensively in the last decades of his career. The alchemists, he argued, were not attempting to make physical gold. They were, in their symbolic way, describing the psychological process of transformation. And the central principle of alchemical transformation is patience. You cannot rush the gold out of the ore. You provide the right conditions and wait. Let the body be still. Let the breath be what it is. Shadow work without force looks like this: noticing when a disproportionate reaction arises that something personal is activated. Not diagnosing it immediately, just noticing. It looks like listening to the dreams with some regularity, without demanding that they produce insight on demand. It looks like sitting with discomfort, not trying to resolve it, not trying to suppress it, but letting it be present with a quality of attention that is interested rather than frightened. It looks like what is happening right now. A willingness to be in the presence of ideas that take the inner life seriously without knowing in advance what they will produce. The shadow material that is ready to emerge will emerge. It will not emerge because you forced it. It will emerge because you were available, because you created a space in which its arrival was possible. The gold that the alchemists were looking for was always already present. It was just mixed with material that needed time to separate. The process is not about production. It is about patience, attention, and the willingness to trust that the psyche knows what it is doing. Your shadow has been working on this longer than you have. It will find its way to the surface when the conditions are right. Tonight may be one of those times. Or it may simply be a night in which the conditions become slightly more favorable. Either way, it is enough. Chapter 33, Therapy of the Night. Irvin Yalom, in his memoir Becoming Myself, published in 2017, wrote about the quality of attention that late hours bring, the lowering of defenses, the accessibility of material that daylight somehow renders less available. He noticed that his most important therapy sessions often happened at the end of a long day, when both patient and therapist were tired. When the social performance that structures early sessions, the patient's careful self-presentation, the therapist's professional persona, had worn thin, when what was left was more honest. Carl Jung had observed the same thing in a different context. He believed that the transition states, the moments between waking and sleeping, between the effort of the day and the release of night, were psychologically privileged. In those transitions, the ego's grip loosens. The material that has been kept below awareness by the effort of functioning has a chance to rise. The night is its own form of therapy. Not because it produces insight on demand, it rarely does, but because it provides conditions that the daytime cannot. The withdrawal of social obligation, the suspension of role, the reduction of sensory input, the body's relaxation of its daylight vigilance. In these conditions, the psyche does work that daylight cannot. The neuroscientist Matthew Walker, who has written extensively about the science of sleep, found that the sleeping brain is not idle, it is reorganizing. During REM sleep, the brain replays the emotional content of the day's experience, but without the stress hormones that were present during the original experience. This allows emotional memory to be processed without the activation of the original threat response. The memory is, in a sense, updated. The charge around it is reduced. Walker's research is a scientific description of what Jung described in psychological terms. The night processes what the day generates. Sleep is not an absence of psychological activity. It is a different form of it. Let your breath be easy. Let the body go quiet. The therapy of the night does not require your active participation. It happens regardless. But the quality of what it has to work with is affected by what you bring to the edge of sleep. A mind that comes to the edge of sleep, tightly wound, defending, planning, rehearsing, gives the sleeping psyche difficult material to process. A mind that comes to sleep somewhat loosened, having spent some time in the company of ideas that take the inner life seriously, having allowed some of the day's pressure to diffuse, gives it better conditions. This is, in the gentlest possible sense, what tonight has been. Not therapy in the formal sense, not a treatment or a practice or a program. Just an hour in which the inner life has been taken seriously, without agenda, without outcome required. Whatever the night does with that, whatever the dreaming mind finds in it, whatever emerges in the morning with a slightly different quality than it had before, is its own business. You do not need to oversee it. The night knows what it is doing. It has been doing it since long before there were words for what it does. Rest now. Let it begin. Chapter 34. Inner Peace Through Integration. The peace that most people are looking for when they come to a place like this is not the absence of thought. It is not the blank silence of a mind emptied of content. They have tried that. The mind does not go blank. It fills itself. The peace they are looking for is something different, closer to what the psychologist Abraham Maslow called being cognition, a quality of awareness in which the self is not at war with its experience, in which what is present is not constantly being evaluated against what should be present. Carl Jung called this approximately integration, the state in which the parts of the psyche that have been in conflict have reached a working relationship. Not a final peace, not the elimination of tension, a relationship. Thich Nhat Hanh, writing in Peace is Every Step, published in 1991, described peace not as a destination, but as a quality of movement. He wrote that peace is not something you find when the conditions are finally right. It is something you practice in the conditions that exist now, not by ignoring what is difficult, by being present with it in a way that does not add fighting to the difficulty. This is remarkably close to what Jung was describing from the other direction. Jung arriving at integration through the lens of depth psychology. Thich Nhat Hanh arriving at the same place through the lens of Buddhist practice. Two very different traditions, two very different methods describing the same quality of being. That quality is not achieved, it is allowed. Let your body go heavy. Let the breath slow. Let the face soften. Integration does not mean having resolved everything. It means having a different relationship to the unresolved. The shadow material is still there. It does not disappear. But it is in conversation rather than in conflict with the conscious self. The persona is still operative. It has its legitimate function. But it is worn lightly, not mistaken for the self. The complex still activates, but the person who experiences it can, more of the time, notice the activation as activation, can step back far enough to see it as a pattern, to recognize its source, to respond rather than react. This is not enlightenment. It is not perfection. It is the ordinary, hard-won progress of a psyche that has been paying attention for long enough that it has developed what Jung called psychological consciousness, awareness of the inner life as a reality that can be worked with. It begins with nights like this one, with the willingness to sit with ideas that take the depth of the self seriously, with the practice of listening to what the night brings instead of fighting what the day left behind. Whatever peace is available tonight is this: a mind that has been, for a few hours, pointed inward rather than outward, a body that has been resting, a self that has been briefly released from the obligation of performing. That is not nothing. It is, in some hours, more than enough. Chapter 35. The Self Beneath the Noise. The noise does not stop. That is the first thing to understand, and the last. Viktor Frankl, writing in Man's Search for Meaning, described a moment in the camps when he stood exhausted in the pre-dawn dark and became aware of something he could only describe as stillness. Not outside. The situation was loud, cold, brutal. But inside, beneath the fear and the hunger and the grief, there was a place that was not touched by any of it, a place that watched. He did not know what to call it then. Later, he used the language of logotherapy, the specifically human capacity for self-transcendence, the ability to take a position on one's own experience from a place that is not identical to the experience itself. Carl Jung called it the self, with a capital S to distinguish it from the ego. The self, in Jungian psychology, is the organizing center of the whole psyche, the part that contains both the conscious and the unconscious aspects of the person and is larger than either. The self is not the noise. The self is what the noise is happening in. This is not a mystical claim, though it has mystical resonances. It is a psychological observation. When you are able to witness your own thoughts and feelings, when you can watch the inner critic do its work without becoming the inner critic, can observe the anxiety without being consumed by it, the witnessing is happening from somewhere. Something in you is watching. That something is the self, the silent witness, the part that does not age the way the persona ages, does not exhaust the way the ego exhausts, does not suffer the way the complex suffers. It simply watches. With a quality of attention that is, in the best moments, something close to compassion. Let the breath slow. Let the body be still. Let whatever is moving in your mind move, the way clouds move across a sky. The sky does not become the clouds. The sky is what the clouds move across. This is one of Jung's most important clinical findings, stated in its simplest form. And it is also one of the hardest to hold in the difficult hours. When the noise is at its loudest, the sky is hard to find. It does not feel like sky. It feels like cloud all the way down. But the practice, and it is a practice, it cannot be done once and completed, is to keep asking the question, where am I in relation to this? Not the thought, not the feeling, not the familiar pattern, but me. Where am I? And to find, however briefly, the place that is noticing, the still point in the turning world. You can find it tonight. Not permanently, not cleanly, but here, in this quiet, in the dark, in the hour when the noise has softened and something older has become more audible, you can find the self beneath the noise. It has been here all along. It has been waiting with patience for exactly this kind of quiet. Chapter 36. Sleep beside the unconscious. The room is the same room it was when we began. The ceiling has not changed. The hour is later. And something in you, not everything, not dramatically, not in a way that will be immediately legible in the morning, is perhaps a little different than it was. Carl Jung, at the end of his long life in Zurich, gave an interview that was recorded and released after his death. He was asked what he most wanted people to understand about psychology, about the inner life, about what he had spent 60 years trying to describe. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said that the soul is real. Not soul in a specifically religious sense, not as doctrine, But soul as the name for the depth dimension of the person, the part that is not adequately described by behavior, by diagnosis, by social role, by any of the external measures that human beings use to assess each other. The part that dreams, the part that longs, the part that reaches imprecisely and persistently towards something it cannot quite name. He said he wanted people to know that this part is real, that taking it seriously is not a weakness or an indulgence, that a life in which it is attended to is different in quality from a life in which it is ignored. We have been attending to it tonight, in the quiet way that this kind of space makes possible, in the soft movement through ideas that one man generated from decades of listening, to his patience, to his own dreams, to the tradition he inherited and expanded, to the voices he chose to receive rather than dismiss. The night mind that was moving when we began has perhaps settled somewhat. Not because anything was resolved, because things were held, because ideas that take the night seriously were present. Let the breath be easy. Let the jaw go soft. Let the body rest without any task remaining. Do you remember the shape of what you were avoiding? We said it had a name. We said we would come to it. We did come to it. It arrived, as these things always do, sideways, in the chapter about the shadow, in the chapter about the wound, in the chapter about the unlived life. It did not announce itself. It settled in quietly, the way recognitions settle, without fanfare, without drama, just the small shift of something becoming very slightly less hidden. You do not have to name it now. The unconscious that has been working alongside you tonight, in the dreams that will come, in the images that will arrive in the transition between this hour and sleep, will continue its work. It does not stop when you stop listening. It is the part of you that does not need an audience. The lamp in the window can go dark. The study door can close. The night has done what the night does. You were here. The ideas were here. The quiet was here. And something very old and very patient was here also. The part of the psyche that has been speaking to human beings in the language of dreams and symbols and the weight of certain hours since long before any of the thinkers we named tonight were born. It is still speaking. The wisest response you can make in this hour is the one that requires nothing from you. Close your eyes. Let the breath come and go. Let the body be held by whatever holds it. The rest does not need your help. Sleep now.